All right, so
This meeting is being recorded.
Sorry, that was loud.
that's good. One thing to know here is all three of these projects are similar in a sense, other than just, the nature of the historic sites themselves. The technology and the presentation technology, I should say, is quite similar. So there is something. In fact, Neil, could you maybe just go hit a web browser and just share that and just look for, just write like VR cave. I just want to show what that concept is. So yeah, we can just actually leave it like this, but essentially a virtual reality cave is, first of all, it's kind of based on Plato's notion of the cave, where, if you're familiar with that, where it's kind of a strange story about prisoners and everything, but essentially it ends up just really being about people looking at shadows and not knowing or believing that they're essentially real. So it's sort of like the first cinema experience. And so, but they're in an environment where they can't really turn their heads away from the screen, let's say, and they're just looking at shadows, and that sort of becomes their reality. So it's kind of based on that. And then it's a kind of a forced acronym too, but it's essentially, it means it's a virtual environment. And you see the early type of cave is kind of represented here, and it's essentially a cube that you go in, and there's three sides and a floor. So and often, not always, but often you'll be wearing stereoscopic glasses, so like polarized lenses or some such thing. So it's actually three-dimensional too, so like a 3D movie, but you're in a 3D environment. So it's pretty cool. It really gives you a sense of presence. And so we have one here at Ball State, but it's sort of the new thinking of a cave. So instead of being inside of a cube, you're actually inside of a sphere. So it's kind of, if you imagine like you're standing in a planetarium, but the top's cut off. It's sort of like that. And oh my headphones are yelling at me. I might have to switch headphones. But anyway, I just wanted to show that because all three projects here are presented at all at museums, and they're all presented in a permanent cave environment. So the advantage of that, unlike, I'm sure you're all familiar with the headsets that you can, buy at Best Buy now or whatever, like the Quest 2, that kind of thing, that's an individual experience. The cave, you can get like 20, sometimes 30 people, depending on how large it is. And you don't have to put any technology in. So you can just go in and automatically just experience it. So that's what we're going to be looking at. So now we can go back to Newark now. So this site is not too far from us. The IDIA and then later the Hopewell cultures created a whole series of a network of these mounds sites. The Newark site was built approximately 100 BCE or BC, let's say, and it was occupied till about 400 AD. And it was a ceremonial site. So it wasn't necessarily a site that was occupied with a village and that kind of thing, although there were houses there, but they were believed to be more sort of like groundskeeper, caretaker kind of structures. So people that maintain the site, and sort of seasonally or ritualistically, everyone would come from a pretty wide area for certain events. And it was also believed to have significant celestial alignments. And what that means is the sun, the moon, sometimes there's alignments with stars or planets that are being studied. Obviously we don't know what was actually intended alignment. And that's what we do a lot of. Archaeologists will come to us with these questions or a thesis about, well, let's say on a certain feast day or a certain, maybe it's the equinox or the solstice, or, could there have been an alignment looking down like a certain structure at a certain time? Maybe it's the summer solstice sunrise or the winter solstice sunset. And so what our lab does is we do a recreation of the site as it existed in its era of construction. So we recreate it digitally, and then we orient it so it sits on a virtual Earth. And a site like this, we actually have to take into it's so large, we have to take into account the fact that the Earth is a sphere. There's curvature to get this all right. And then it's located by latitude, longitude, altitude, how high from sea level, and then its orientation, so the compass rotation. So once that's all registered, we use this NASA database to then look at virtual sun, virtual moon, stars, planets, whatever might be of interest. So that's what we'll be talking about here. So we just jump in here. So I think to understand the site a little better, Neil, we probably should look at the satellite image at first, because this site barely exists today. Most of what you see is a golf course and a lot of houses. And so this is a problem, right? So now in trying to understand the site, now the extent of the site, maybe if you kind of pull out enough to show, let's see, are we seeing the southern circle? I can't even tell. There it is, yeah. So that's a good amount of the site. So Neil, could you kind of, with your cursor, could you lasso the northwest circle in octagon and show people where? So that's the golf course. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then on the southeast, that's another circle. Now, if you could like temporarily toggle back over to our restoration model. So that's showing one feature. Do we have a map that you can call up that shows the whole campus or site? If not, you can Google it. I forget if it's in this book. Yeah, I just maybe Google it. But so one of the ways that we know, and we'll zoom into the golf course in just a second so you can see, because just looking at it, it just looks like a golf course, but you kind of play through different mounds. And some people, I mean, that is strange, obviously, but the fact that there's a golf course there has also, in a sense, helped preserve the site, because I mean, it's kind of counterintuitive because obviously there's, sand traps and putting greens and things like that. But more or less, they kept the features intact. And let's see what we have here. So I'll show you the whole layout because it's quite extensive. Let's see. Well, I'll let Neil do that. Well, talking about there we go. So what we've relied on very heavily is during the 19th century, there were several surveys done of early, Western archaeologists came in and did these drawings. And so these existed then. It wasn't until later in the 20th century or late 19th century that settlements started to be built, and just essentially, bulldozing a lot of these avenues and other mounds features, unfortunately. And so there's very little of this left. So Neil and I have to scratch our heads and try to recreate this through, obviously the satellite imagery, anything that exists. There are archaeological surveys that have used, ground penetrating radar or actual digs that have located certain spots. And we kind of use those as registration points to kind of reference these early drawings over what's known today. But these early drawings, they're not like, now you hop in a plane and use, a laser, essentially, something called LiDAR, and it just scans. It's, everybody's used to Google Maps, Apple Maps, things like that. But essentially, you're taking a three-dimensional scan instantly, and it's spot on, right? But back then, there are errors in these drawings. They're wonderful, but they're inaccurate. So we have to kind of create what's called a consensus map. So it's just essentially taking all the data and find a way to kind of reconcile all the differences and create one version that most likely is as close as at least we can get. So Neil, do you want to go back over to the golf course and zoom in a little bit to the circle? And because you can, so Neil, if you want to, with your cursor, if you want to show where the circle is and maybe show where the octagon is.
That was the other circle up here. Circle, an octagon.
Yeah. So that's the circle and the octagon. And they still exist. They're in the process of trying to get the mounds or get the golf course people to relocate their golf course and get rid of the trees and the sand traps and things because it would have been cleared. Also, Ohio is really proud of their indigenous heritage, and they're in the process of applying for UNESCO World Heritage status, and they're pretty close. So they keep getting closer. So that's exciting. Indiana has plenty of these sites too. It's just that Ohio's further ahead and celebrating that, I would say. So Neil, why don't we go back to the actual simulation? And I should probably change my headphones before they die. I didn't realize they were low. Okay, so again, this is what you're looking at is something that you would experience in a cave. And what Neil's showing you on the right, he's moving the camera dynamically with the joystick that you see on the left. So the left side, if you were there, if you were present, this would be the control surface. So this is actually on a touch screen. So so you're looking at two screens. The left side is the touch screen information. So you learn a little bit. You can touch and click and navigate and at your own pace. But also you can control the camera. And on the right side is the output. But we're just showing you one screen. Essentially, this cave has 4 live cameras. So this one actually is somewhat similar to the historic kind of cave that Neil showed us in the beginning with a front, a floor, and 2 sides. So it's kind of this one is boxy like that. And so, but we can go through here. So earthworks, why don't you just kind of take us through the informational side of things here. Okay. So we're into the some of the alignments. So what you're seeing is on the left, you see a vector that if you stand on, let's say the edge of that stand on the edge of that circle, there is an observation platform which was paved in limestone. And if you look down the center axis of the mounds site, so at least this section with the circle and octagon, you'll see what's called the maximum northern moonrise. And I don't want to get too complicated here with the moon, but the moon does in 1 month what the sun does in a year, essentially. So you know how in the winter time the sun is low on the horizon and it's high in the summer, and then it has in the summertime it's light till really up like almost 10 o'clock here, like 9:30 or something. So the sun's very much to the north where it sets and rises, and then in the winter it's the opposite. We have very short days, so it gets dark at 5, right? So the moon does that same, I shouldn't say the same, similar kind of idea that ping pongs back and forth. So this is referring to the most northern distance that the moon will set as it ping pongs around in its cycle, if that makes sense. So why don't we just kind of advance through some of these, Neil? And I won't explain all these, but once you understand that, it's pretty self-explanatory. So here's the minimum southern moonrise. So some of these are moonrises, some of these are moon sets. Sunrise and sunsets, whatever. So, and Neil, if you want to, Neil, why don't you explain the little console on the lower right?
Sure. So under the menu in this corner here, it gives the user a chance to dial in a specific day and a month and year if they want, or if they can scrub through the time, they can watch the sun and moon path through the sky through different times of day using that NASA data that John had talked about. So they can either start with the presets and explore those days, or if they're curious about some other day, they could say they want to try April instead. They can do that, watch how the moon moves around. It'll pull different data and they can explore the different parts of the year.
Great. And while you were talking, I changed my headphones. Perfect. All right. And yes, so yeah, go ahead. And so there's a lot of, not redundance, but similarity here. But it's essentially, it's for public education, to learn about the site and appreciate the engineering. Now some of these alignments, I mean, are they intended by the peoples that built these sites? We don't know. These are theorized by archaeoastronomers or archaeologists, and they're wondering, they see that it lines up, and they're like, So these are just kind of noted. And what we do with our lab is we confirm whether they work or not. And if they work, there's some validity certainly, right? So you can go ahead and skip through some of this.
I think we're back to the beginning here.
We're back at the beginning. Okay. So that's pretty much this site. Before we move on, were there any questions about the Newark site or the golf course?
Yeah, let me see, since we can't see hands. Any questions, y'all? Yes. I had the question, how far is Newark from here? That might be a question.
Yeah, so it's close to Columbus, Ohio. So it's basically in the center of the state. So it's about it's east of Columbus. So it's like maybe 3+ hours, 3:15, something like that.
Yep, Google tells me a 3-hour drive. Okay.
There you go.
Any other questions before we move on to, I guess, the next site? And yeah, all right. It's looking pretty quiet in the classroom. I think we have a go ahead.
All right. Why don't we? I know you didn't ask for this site, but I can show it briefly. In this piece, in this exhibit, we also talk about something called Fort Ancient, which is also near Columbus. So we can show that briefly. So Fort Ancient, essentially, that part of Ohio is very hilly. It's not like this part of Indiana. And they built a settlement on which actually what were villages on top of us, essentially like let's call it a mesa. It's a flat-topped hill, so it afforded some natural protection, right? Because the ravines there are pretty steep actually, and so this also has some suspected alignments. We have found some on our own and proposed those as well from the lab, which I should actually write about, but we did. They are in the exhibit. Neil, do you want to show, maybe go to a browser and just go to Fort Ancient and just show the actual site. Now, luckily, the site, there's no golf course, there's no housing development. It's pretty intact. The only thing up on top of the flat kind of mesa hill is, ranger's house and a visitor center, that kind of thing. And it's pretty much intact. So we didn't have to do as much head scratching to try and interpret it. Of course, it's treed, so it's kind of hard to see the extent of it. But they did build, so even though they're up on a flat top and they're somewhat protected, they did build an enclosure around the whole thing. So there's essentially what's called like a palisade wall, almost like you'd see in a medieval castle, that there'd be an outer wall that people would have to get past. Like if you don't have good intentions, they slow you down. And then there was, because they dug into the earth to get the clay to make the palisade walls out of the clay. Conversely, you ended up with a negative cavity, right, where all the dirt came from. Those became ponds. So they believe the ponds, obviously were used for water, holding water because they're up and they're isolated. There is a river down below, but you'd want to have water up there, and also fish and other, perhaps aquatic plants, maybe for food or textiles or whatever it may be. So we've essentially done the same thing. I won't spend much time on this because you probably didn't talk about it, but this is also near Columbus. So if you're curious and you go out there, you can do kind of 2 sites in one day if you're interested. And then this has plenty of alignments too. The one alignment I'll talk about, Neil, if we can show between Neil and I, we call it the turkey neck, but you can see that axis to the northeast has that little head on it, kind of thing. So that points to the, like precisely down that avenue, points to a summer solstice sunrise event, which is pretty cool. And so, although unfortunately that's all gone, that area is all housing. So that part of the site is essentially destroyed, but the upper flat area is intact. So let's move on to the other. Well, are there any questions about Fort Ancient? I know I just much time.
No, I think this is so valuable to show how digital tools can reveal what doesn't even exist anymore on the ground, and how, you know, just the value of this work. Does anybody have anything to add? Any questions, comments, observations? I hope y'all guys find this as cool as I do. Okay. All right. They seem fine. No more questions. Last call for this one before we move on to the next. All right. I have a oh wait, yes, in the back.
Yeah.
Hold on. John, can you hear in the back, or shall I repeat?
Could you repeat it?
Yeah, I had a comment that it looks almost like the head of a serpent with that curve. Do you want to come up and talk into the microphone? I just noticed. Mm-hmm. Oh, it was wondering if it was designed in the shape of a serpent, which is an interesting reading.
That is an interesting reading, because not too far from this site is another site called Serpent Mound. And Neil, could you just Google like Serpent Mound, Ohio? A lot of you have probably seen this. This is actually very, very famous. It's the most famous Ohio mound. We have not done a study on it yet. However, I'd love to. But it's spectacular. It's, you know, what they call an effigy mound. So it's in the shape of an animal, essentially a snake eating or swallowing like an egg, it sort of looks like. A lot of ideas about what it's doing. But there it is. And there also are, and that's also up on a hill. But that's a very, very famous site, and that absolutely is a serpent. So I think there's a high probability that there is a connection there.
That's a great observation. Thank you for contributing. Oh, I have another hand.
What's the height of that mound?
What is the height of the mound? The Fort Ancient, you mean?
Yeah, like, can you walk up it?
Can you walk up it? Is it an elevation? Is it a marked elevation?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because it's really hard to tell from what we're showing. Some of them are about 2 meters, so maybe, you know, roughly the height of a tall human, let's say, height. That's probably some of the lower. So when you see those roads, they pretty much, you know, maybe a meter to 2 meters high. But some of them are quite high, like on the lower circle at Newark, that is about 25 feet tall. That circle, so it's quite tall, and it's like, you know, taken centuries of, you know, because they're digging with, you know, simple tools, and they're moving the dirt typically in baskets. So fill a basket, put it on your head, walk up you know, dump it, come back down. Probably take 100 years to build this whole complex. It's very, very impressive. Yep, good question.
Yeah, one more follow-up.
All right, so other than ceremonies, were these mounds used for storage or transporting stuff, or is it some form of technology?
Other than ceremonies, were they used for transport or other forms of technology?
Yes, the sites were linked by roads, and some of the roads go for 20 miles, and so they would interconnect for trade and you know, obviously accessing, you know, the ceremonial event. But yeah, there were the one out of Neil, is it convenient to show the Newark site briefly? Actually, maybe it's best to show it on just Google an image because I want to show that one road. Well, yeah, you can see it here. So you see how there's sort of avenues that sort of jut out from the octagon? You can see they go off into the distance. They go to other sites. So, and some of them are 20 miles away. So yeah, they were all interconnected with essentially a series of highways. That
Nice.
pond, by the way, is seasonal. So it would just fill in rainy seasons and as a source of water and such. Yeah.
Was it also man-made? Was the pond also the quarry for the sediment, or was it a natural feature as far as you can tell?
That's a very good question. I don't know. It would make sense that, because often when they, like, if you look at one of these roads, there's an enclosure on the left and the right of it. But to do that, they just dug adjacent to it, so it created a ditch, right? Now, some of the other things like the octagon, there's no ditch. So that dirt had to come from somewhere, right? So
Right.
perhaps that was essentially quarried.
All right. Any other questions for the third site? No. Okay. We have the go ahead.
All righty. And then I think we're at where are we going? Oh, Angel Mounds?
Mhm.
Okay. Angel Mounds. Angel Mounds is in Indiana. And if you've been down to the Evansville area, it's very close to there. It's on the southern tip of the state. Large site. This has not opened yet. It's a museum exhibit at the new what is it? Sorry, I'm trying to get the name right. But well, let's just call it because it's named after somebody who I forget now. Beck or somebody. But it's opening in spring now. It's supposed to open this October, but it's essentially their anthropology and archaeology museum at Indiana University in Bloomington. But it does have a family name attached to it. Forgetting. But so that will open in spring. So if you're in Bloomington, spring on, you'll be able to see this. And this is a pretty spectacular exhibit because it's essentially in a dome. So imagine something like an igloo kind of shape where, kind of got a planetarium dome, but then there's an access into it, which is essentially like a portal or cylinder you can go into. That's essentially the structure. And it's about 25 feet wide, so you can fit maybe close to 20 people in it. And then there's a touch screen. And so what Neil's going to show you is kind of a combination of things. You'll see this like funny image that we're looking at right now. That's because it's rendered spherically. So it's going in essentially a planetarium. And he was also showing a little bit of the user interface. So that does have a touch screen. And so you can navigate and go through and learn about the site and the people's what's learned or what we know about basketry, pottery, whatever is that we have a record of. So so let's see, what are we? Angel in the air. So here's the site. The site was built up over a couple hundred years, different phases. These people had some serious enemies, it would seem, because they had massive palisade walls, very, very impressive, and with little parapets and things like that, to not only watch but also probably defend. And there was a series of two walls. One was a wooden one that was lower. There was a massive palisade wall, which is probably 20 feet tall. And it also had a natural kind of defense because one edge just touched the Ohio River. So it was totally enclosed. You had river on one side, which obviously you could canoe up to, but kind of a natural defense of sorts. Neil, do you want to just take us through some things we can look at here? So that was Angel from the Air. So that was sort of like the introductory experience. It takes you through phases. Again, it looks a little funny, right? Because spherical. Gonna have to get past that. But so here, so feet on the ground view of one of the settlements. And all the house positions are pretty accurate. There's evidence of post holes that we use to place the houses. So we know the dimension of the house, the rotation, all that. of course, they get rebuilt over the, this is, ephemeral, or, it's wood and clay and things like that. So it has to be rebuilt often. So you'll see the post holes kind of wiggle around over time, but more or less they're accurate. Yeah, just kind of slices of life. They've gone back and forth whether they want to represent people or not. And I think they're in the mood right now where they don't want people represented. So a lot of this is vetted by tribal input. And so they're part of the process. And this version, there's no people here, right, Neil? Or are there people? No, there are people. Sorry. This version, there are people. You see they're building a house over there. But right now they want us to take the people out. There's the latest input. Just issues about representation. We didn't. There's very little of evidence of clothing and jewelry and such, or hairstyles and things like that survive in this case. In this particular site, they since those are questions about that, there's become representation issues. With how did people look and dress and that kind of thing. So it's, on one hand, you could just avoid the whole thing by not having people interpreted. Why don't you add a few things? You can. Oh, the forest resources. Yeah, forest is quite nice. I like the forest. So yeah, a lot of this is learning about the habitat, but how they took advantage of the river, or assets the river resources the forest provides, food and construction materials and whatnot. And all of this, you can kind of see there's a sound component that Neil isn't playing. This is again, this navigation's done on a touch screen, but there's a narration, and so you can read it or you can listen to the narrator. And Neil, do you want to add a few things here?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, the user interface is essentially a website, so you can click through different options, and it'll go to different camera positions within different scenes. We've had to do some work trying to figure out what would make people comfortable, because sometimes if you're on a really big cave-like screen and you're moving too fast or rotating too fast, people can get a little wobbly. So we try to take things like that into account, and try and get the right types of trees. So the experts who study this sort of thing tell these sorts of trees or this sorts of resources are what they would use. So we try to make sure we keep that in mind and find or make 3D models that would reference those notes the best, and kind of keep track of our information as to what we use to represent everything.
Right. So as Neil mentioned, these are the correct species that were in this part of the state at that time, and we tried to account too for old growth or virgin forest heights and things. So we do all that homework to make it as accurate as possible. So yeah, let's maybe look at a few other things, because I want to get to Stonehenge. It's kind of, yeah.
Could we have a look at the overview of the mound site? Because there was something you mentioned early on that tied into our lecture.
Okay, sure.
So you mentioned that there were palisades that were discovered.
Correct.
Okay. How were these constructed? Were they made with timber? Were they made with planks of wood to get that height?
Yeah, so they first start off as like, kind of a stockade fence. So like when you see like an old kind of Western fort, they're just made out of timber.
So we looked at the first primary source for descriptions of a living mound building civilization that was compiled from De Soto's men, and they left a description of how these mounds were constructed with the palisades of the timber. And wait, can we zoom into the settlement a little bit? So there's textual backup. I can send you the quote from that text if you want to add it to the site. Can we zoom in on the settlement a wee bit?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so guys, let me pose a question to my class. Is that a flat-topped mound with a structure on top of it? Yeah. Is it? I mean, I'm asking John, is that what I'm looking at?
It is.
Okay, what's the name of that kind of mound, class? Platform mound. Oh, I'm so proud of you. Okay, to what era and civilization do the platform mounds belong? No, yes, but there's a special culture. Mississippian. The Mississippi culture. Yep. Fantastic. This
Okay.
is wonderful.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention that. Yeah, but that's right. This is a Mississippian site, so it very similar to Cahokia if you look at that site.
Oh, I'm so thrilled. This ties in, and I will send you the quote about you know, the European contact with a living Mississippian culture and how they described the construction of palisades and mounds like that.
Neat, yeah. Well,
Oh,
this is this, good.
No, this is so neat. I'm just exclaiming.
Yeah, and so this site is, I mentioned Cahokia, near St. Louis, around East St. Louis in Illinois, is a spectacular site, which is pretty intact. There's some farmers that plowed certain sections down at different points, but there's massive pyramids. They're the largest pyramids north of Mexico and in North America, and they're amazing. They're absolutely amazing. If you're in that area, definitely stop by. And that was a huge trade center. They find shells and stones from all over the country there. It was like literally like the hub um, of that culture, but they also traded with other cultures. And at the time of construction, there were more people there than in London. So it was more populated than London.
Wow.
I forget. Yeah.
I don't know if you know this, but the second largest mound site of the Mississippian period was, notice I'm using the past tense, was Troyville in Louisiana, but it is now under the highway system. So,
Oh, I didn't
but
know that.
yeah, but that was considered the second largest monumental complex.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Oh well, just
Cool.
limiting what was. So
Oh,
we're
I know.
which is, you know, the main hobby of art historians and archaeologists. So we have a nice 9 minutes of class time. Let me ask the students if there's any points, any observations, questions, anything on your minds before we run out of time. Yes.
Mine's kind of more of like a material-based question,
Mhm.
but like for the actual rendering of the 3D, like you hire like artists for that, or is it like within the lab?
I had a question for the rendering of the 3D. Do you hire artists or is it in the lab?
Right. So our staff is comprised of artists, and for the most part, except for Neil, they were all Ball State students. So we have, so the students work with the staff. They learn, and at a certain point, if I can, I try to hire them and have them stay with us. And so, like Neil's been with us pretty much the whole run of the history of the lab and knows quite a bit, and he's a super talented artist. But yeah, everything's in house essentially.
I mean, this is a fabulous resource. I'm going to encourage any interested students, send them an email, maybe pop by. I don't want to overwhelm you, but they're in the architecture building. Absolutely. If this interests you and you love what you're seeing, please get in touch. So,
Yeah,
all
and the
right,
other thing I should mention,
Yep.
sorry, the other thing I should mention is that everything you're seeing obviously is live rendered. We use game engines to do this. So this is all, I didn't really talk about the technology, but this is all using the game engine of Unity. And Unity makes most of your phone games and things like that, but can also do highly polished live work. Neil, could you in a browser, could you just like real quick open up the new demo with the woman in the scene? Um, this is absolutely jaw-dropping. If we can look at it, but just it's been as you guys know with AI and other things, there's just been exponential acceleration of all these technologies. It's just so hard to keep track of, but the advances in graphics, especially generating live images in a game, are just phenomenal. This is I couldn't believe this. This is rendered live. It's not like you'd think. First of all, it's even if it was rendered like for a film, it'd be extraordinary. But what's even more amazing is just live game engine. Maybe scrub to the woman just to save time. So you're getting some, yeah, you're getting some lag just from the frame rate, but you can see the quality here. It's just nuts.
Hmm.
So,
That,
anyway,
are those, you know, coming from a little bit of a film background, are those from scanning the actor?
yes. So that's right.
Yeah.
So she is scanned with the photographic process, but she is a 3D object.
Wow. Guys,
Yeah.
that's what the Screen Actors Guild strike is about. Because if you're scanned once, they can use you forever and not pay you royalties.
Yep,
That's
and synthesize your voice and everything. Yeah.
they own you forever.
Yep. Did you want to
Wow.
see? Do we have any time to show Stonehenge for a minute, or?
Yeah, let's do a
We-
quick Stonehenge. We have 5 minutes of class. So guys, you'll be reading about Stonehenge and encountering it on Monday's lecture. So here's a sneak peek, and I'm so glad we have this resource too. So hang on for 5 minutes, please.
So this is also intended to be a cave experience, so very similar to what you've been looking at. So you see a touch screen on the left and a rectangular version of the viewport on the right. I mean, keep in mind this is also surrounds you spherically. But Neil, why don't you just kind of take us through some things quickly? You can talk through it.
Sure. So we're going to have a tour here of Stonehenge with forward and backward buttons for the museum display. So if they want to learn about the stages of construction, that shows a little overhead map on the user interface and some explanation. And then on the cave, it'll show a spherical version of different stages as they added different stones, and then different more configurations. And then in the end, at the present day, when the stones have fallen down, and kind of go through and track that. We also have a solar tracking feature here as well. So if you want to track different times of day, similar to other projects, you can do that here as well. And you can
There's
also look
presets. So
around.
yeah, there's solar presets. Well, there's also solar and lunar presets. If you want to observe the sun or the moon. But again, this is using Unity and it's all live. The stones were laser scanned, so the ones that exist are very accurately reproduced here. And I should point out, Neil, do you want to show the website real quick? There's a supporting page for this with a live simulation of Stonehenge. Not in the quality that you see here. It's kind of somewhat more simple, but it's something you can access yourself. So if you want to look at something, oh, and Neil, you might show the Newark thing too, real quick. So here, if you go to our website, which is just IDIAlab.org, and
Here we are.
Neil's going to. There's a link here. If you click and click there, this is a walkthrough for one of the Stonehenge. We've done a bunch of Stonehenge pieces, one for the History Channel too, but this one's a kind of a simple simulator, but it does have a lot of complexity to it too. So if you want to look at this video, it's a walkthrough and there's a voice talk through on it. And then Neil, do you want to show the Newark 360 web that they can access? So this way you can play around with this versions of this, on your own computer. Yeah, this one is just a web page. So this I can send Lily the link here if she wants to share it, but then that way people can explore a little bit. So
No, that sounds great. I'll be sharing the links you send me as well as the recording of this. And we're all here, but in case somebody isn't and they want to see all the wonders that you showed us today. So
very good.
this is extraordinary. In the last 2 minutes, thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And let's hear the applause.
Thank
all right,
you.
John. All right.
Fun.
Thank you. And I hope to bring you in another time. This was wonderful.
Perfect. All
All
right.
right. Have a
Thanks,
wonderful
everyone.
rest of the day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.